On March 30th, we talked about the life journey of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers and went on to be one of the greatest leaders of ancient Egypt. Joseph's journey was far from peaceful. In this episode, we're joined by Dr. Aaron Kelson for a conversation about the lack of worldly peace that comes with following our divinely inspired path. Dr. Kelson knows that leading a life of faith can come full of challenges. From his non-traditional student path at Brigham Young University as an undergraduate student, to finishing a PhD in forestry economics from Utah State University, to working in a space far removed from forestry, to finally ending up in northeastern Minnesota, the divine has taken Aaron and his family on a rewarding but challenging journey that has at times not come with peace of this world. Dr. Aaron Kelson, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time. How are you? How are you feeling?
I'm feeling very well. Very, very well up here in Northeast Minnesota.
Oh,
Little cool, but excited to be with you today.
well, and people think for folks, so we're recording this middle of April, April 18th, 2024. What is the weather? What was the weather like today in Northeast Minnesota?
Well, we had a lot of wind, a lot of cloud cover. Our wind shifted directions today. It's coming from the west. Yesterday was coming from the northeast, which enticed me to go over to Lake Superior because that means the waves are going to be big.
Right.
So I spent the day on the shores of Lake Superior just looking at these giant waves. It was beautiful, but it's from the west and cool and cloudy today.
Oh, gorgeous. Well, because people who aren't Minnesotans think Minnesota is Antarctica and it snows year round. And no, there's a whole summer, a very humid summer in the state of 10,000 lakes. So it's always good to get people to understand that there are four very distinct seasons in Minnesota, even in Northeast Minnesota.
That is true.
Yeah, wonderful country. So one of the things to kind of level set this episode, at one point, and many of our listeners know the good friend and brother, Tim Sutherland, Tim and I were having a conversation about him doing some coaching, teaching, loving on me when I was just asking. He said, well, what do you want? And I said, I just want some peace, man. And he said, well, what does peace look like to you? And I said, well, I just like to come to work every day and kind of just do the work and be left alone and kind of have space where I don't always have to look over my shoulder and look for saboteurs and all the things. And he said, well, what are you willing to give up for peace? And I said, what do you mean? Tim is so good. What do you mean? And he said, well, are you willing to give up your edge? And I said, my edge? He said, your call. And I said, absolutely not. And he said, well, people who are following God's call never get the earth's peace or the definition of peace that we as humans think are peace. It's that peace that surpasses all understanding. So, Aaron, I really wanted to dive in, and I appreciate you taking the time. Can you talk a little bit about when I say the word peace, peace be unto you, having peace in your life, what comes to mind for you, and how has that definition changed over time?
Well, peace to me is an assurance that everything will be fine, regardless of the storms that we're weathering at the moment. And I think I always had at least an intellectual understanding of that definition. But when I was younger, I didn't realize the intensity of the storms that could come to me in so many different ways. And so now the actualization of peace through having gone through many storms, including currently, I understand it at a much deeper level than I ever did younger. And that understanding is growing continually. And frankly, don't know how I could get through this life without it.
Well, and you think about Because what you're talking, weather and storms, makes me think of Christ quieting the storm, right? So I always think of Jesus, the man, the carpenter, and the God, right? Both. But I think about this guy who for 30 years was a carpenter. He's a rabbi and a teacher, but his ministry starts at age 30. And he's just he's God, but he's also a man. And the crush of people, and I think about the crush of people, coming and pushing towards him. And he's battling these two things. And at some point, just to get some peace, the only place he can go is out on a boat with his friends. And he goes out on the boat, and what happens? A storm. And he's so exhausted that he's sleeping in the bow of the boat, right? In the bow? Yeah. And the whole time, while his buddies are thinking they're going to die, he is so physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually spent as a person that he is exhausted. And then at some point, they wake him up and he looks up and says, shh, be still, quiet, peace, right? And I think about weathering life storms and finding peace in that. How do you find peace in the middle of those storms? Who do you hold on to? What are some of the scriptural things, the faith things, but also you were talking about walking on Lake Superior. What are some of the things that you do to find peace, even if you aren't completely at peace at that time in your life?
I probably pursue a number of options that anyone I think who has a spiritual mindset would pursue. There is, of course, meeting with fellow believers and gaining strength through their company, and that's very helpful. And I don't want to discount that at all. But for me, a connection to the natural world, which I prefer to call the creation, has been just immensely important since I was very young. And getting out into that space and sometimes just clearing my mind and feeling like that channel to God is a little bit more clear. So, for example, yesterday when I went to Lake Superior, it was very intentional to do that. Sometimes I can get just overwhelmed with all the different burdens that I'm facing. We live about an hour and 15 minutes from my favorite spot on Lake Superior, and several times a year I'll drive over there, walk and reflect, and think about concepts like the Lord calming the storm when I'm looking at a body of water that is not calm at the moment. And that time never fails to rejuvenate me, and I think bring me closer in harmony with the Lord's Spirit. If we have a moment, I could relate a story of when I almost died on Lake Superior when I was 10.
Oh, please do.
And that story has greatly impacted my life, that account. When I was 10 and we were living in Upper Michigan, my dad, my cousin, dad's friend, his son, and myself were stuck on Lake Superior for 6.5 hours in an April storm with a non-functioning engine on the boat. A 15-foot boat in 16-foot waves and still ice, chunks on the lake. And we would be riding the waves. Sometimes it'd be in the trough, sometimes up on the crest, and you'd see a block of ice coming towards you, and it was going to hit the boat. And you would think to yourself, this is it. We will die because it's going to cave in the boat. And for 6.5 hours, we prayed like I have never prayed before, and maybe even never since, with a fervor. Through a series of really miraculous events, we were rescued by the Coast Guard probably a half an hour before we would have been crushed by the ice. And we survived. And beginning from that experience, I've always had this connection with Lake Superior that's been deeper than most. It's a place where I realized, maybe for the first time, how real God is to me. That He literally saved my life, saved the life of my father, and gave me a chance to live. So when I go back to the lake now, those memories are fresh to me and they help me to face whatever it is I'm dealing with. So that's one way that I can restore the peace.
I love that. If God can bring you through that storm, my guess is there's some, whether it's conscious or not, what are the other storms you're facing? Hey, he can bring me through that. It makes me
Right.
think about Paul's letter to the church at Philippi and him talking about the peace that surpasses all understanding, right? We don't, our definition of peace is different than the peace of God, right, through Jesus Christ. And what that looks like, and it surpasses our understanding. I think about it at being at peace with the fact that there is going to be ice, you know, surging at our boats, literally, and there's going to be waves, and there's going to be peaks, and there's going to be valleys. But being at peace with that, what do you think is the difference between our worldly understanding of peace and the peace that Paul is talking about that surpasses all understanding in our hearts and in our minds through Christ Jesus?
Well, I think in the world, peace is often associated with um, material prosperity, status, just this well-being that we are in control. We're in control of our lives. Whereas the peace that comes to us from being connected with God is not necessarily that we are in control of our external circumstances, but we are very much in control with His help of how we relate to those, how we process them, how we know that there's a greater end than what we're seeing at the moment. And so we we can endure those, and I don't want to say just endure, but actually triumph over those hardships because of that peace within. Um, when my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer at a very inopportune time for me, not that there is a good time for such a thing to happen, but that his diagnosis and then passing occupied a very short period of time, 9 weeks. And I had to process that at a very difficult time in my life. And it was hard. I'm not going to deny that. It was hard. But nevertheless, I had this assurance, I had this peace that I would be okay, my family would be okay. And frankly, that my association with him was not over. And so that carried me through. And I see people in the world facing situations like that, and sometimes they never recover. And I feel badly for them. Peace is not something that's easily shared unless you have worked hard to build it yourself. But you can try to encourage people, but it's hard to just impart to them.
Well, it's that muscle memory, right? That it
Right.
requires slowly building up. You can't be at peace with if you aren't doing the work to constantly, because that's what the world, that's what the deceiver does, right? Is try to distract us from the peace that comes from and the peace that is within. And so we always have to be turning our minds back to, wait a minute, no, no, no. I want this type of peace because that's the peace that's in our hearts and in our minds, not in our bodies, right? which is very different. There's this whole study, and I think in one of our episodes, Tim and I were talking about this, where they ask Americans, how much more stuff, money, things do you need to be at peace, to be happy? And no matter how much money a person makes, they all say between 12 and 15% more.
Mm.
But after the initial rush of getting 12 to 15% more wears off, the study says that nobody has any more happiness or peace, right? Because the peace comes in our hearts and in our minds, which is comes from knowing, right, that you have a bigger purpose, a bigger call. Talk about, Doc, a little bit about when I say the word to be called or have a calling or to have a gift, what does, for all the people that don't understand in a a theological way or a biblical way, in your mind, what does it mean to be called or embracing your call? And when did you first figure out what God's call was on your life?
That's a profound and very personal question to our calling. You know, sometimes we think of a calling in a formal way, but I think the more powerful way of looking at it is probably what you are alluding to here, is that it is personal. And we begin to understand that we have a purpose to fulfill his work in a way that no one else can exactly duplicate. And so we need to be true to that. And sometimes it's hard because we doubt ourselves. We doubt that we could really be someone noticed by God, the creator of all and the sustainer of all. How could he know us and have this calling for us? And for me, when I was quite young, as I mentioned before, my connection with the creation is almost very unusual in the world. And sometimes I hate to say this, but been a little embarrassed by how strong that is and unsure about how to talk about that because it's so spiritual to me. But I do believe that's a calling for me to help people realize that every breath that they take is a connection with the Creator, and He is not far from us ever, that He's closer to us than the blood within our own veins. And we can feel His presence all around us all the time. And that's been a calling for me, and how to articulate that and how to model that. I'm still learning, but I've grown into that confidence a little more. I'm still growing into it. That's been one of the callings. And I think part of it then is just trusting that the Lord knows what He's doing with us and that He's prepared us. It's not something that's just happened out of the blue. He has prepared us to do these things.
That's right. Well, and knowing, giving credit where credit is due, right? Because when you admit you have a call, you admit you have a gift, then you have to do something. It's the parable of the three servants, right? You have to do something. It can't be this false humility because my call didn't come from me, right? It comes from higher power, Allah, Jehovah, Yahweh, right? That's where it comes
Mm-hmm.
from. And then the question is, do I bury it or do I multiply it? Do I live in fear of acting? Do I live in fear of scorn from the world? Or do I multiply what he's given me to do because of righteousness, right? That's that's the reality. And it's the challenge for all of us. When you're talking about how your relationship came out of storm, many of our listeners know my relationship with God started in a childhood of abuse, being beaten every day, being, afraid, being all of these things that I lived with. And then my stepdad coming and then having abuse happening around me between him and my mom every day. But what it did is make me really close to the person that God is. And so I just got it differently. When, see, Aaron, you and I as brothers, right? When you're pulled out of literal storms, all of a sudden things become real, right? And you have this
Mm.
relationship that is deeply personal. It isn't for me, it isn't a relationship that is a what I always say is, oh, that relationship in the creator. The relationship is almost like a friend, a guide who loved me enough to bring me through. And there had to be a reason why, right?
Mm.
Talk a little bit because for you, one of the things in talking about divine inspiration, and I know that there was God's hand in playing a part for you to decide to do your doctoral work. What was the situation in your life when you made that decision? And how did that have to do with being divinely called and searching for the peace of God?
Thank you for asking that question. I don't get many opportunities to walk through that history. Um, when I first became consciously aware that this was part of the tapestry of my life was just about 1988 to 1989. I had finished my undergraduate in business. I was working in business in the Twin Cities and trying to make a career of it. And I kept feeling a level of discontent with what I was doing. And I couldn't really describe it. There was just this persistent feeling that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. And I started thinking, what would I do if I could do anything? Well, how would I reorient my life? What would that look like? And I realized that when I had lived in Northeast Minnesota as a teenager, I had just developed this incredible love for the people here and the challenges that they face in a resource dependent economy. A lot of booms and busts and people being laid off and all the problems that go along with the social problems that go along with that. And I thought, you know what I'd really like to do is learn something where I could maybe go back there and help them. And I said, if I could just make a change, that's what I would do. But how can I possibly do it? I have one child. I have another one on the way. How can I transition to something different? Well, this is when I think God intervened and he helped me get laid off. Now, that doesn't seem like a great blessing, but I did, in fact, get laid off. And I said, well, this is it. This is my opportunity to go back and pursue what I think might enable me to help people in this area that had come to mean so much to me. So I decided, oh, I'm going to do it. We're going to go to graduate school. I'm going to study natural resources economics. I'm going to learn every single thing I can possibly learn to hopefully go back there and help. And fortunately, my wife was with me on all of this. And that's an important part of being divinely guided is that we're not, it's sort of like the law of witnesses. If there's more than one of us involved, it's stronger. And she was with me on that. So that began a 7-year odyssey from that point, 7 to 8 years to finish a doctoral degree. And then that story continues. And I want to give you a chance to interject anything if you like to, because it's a
No,
long story. So I don't
no,
want,
it's
yeah,
really good. I think that
yeah,
one of the things that our listeners, and I remember talking to my oldest daughter, you know daughters, Aaron,
I
right?
do.
36 is my oldest daughter.
Mm.
And and 4 children, like someone we know with three. And I said, one day she said to me, I wish God would talk to us like he talked to people in olden days. And I said, oh, what do you mean? Well, he just talked to Moses and told Moses what to do. And I said, honey, Moses was in that wilderness for 40 years. He walked by that bush every stinking day. He was tending the sheep out there for 40. Do you know how many times Moses walked by the bush and didn't notice it was burning and not being consumed? You know how many times God was speaking? It doesn't say God is speaking in this huge auditory human way, right? I wouldn't think God's voice works that way. But I said to her, God speaks to us all the time. We're just either too distracted, too focused on our own stuff, or too fearful of what God is saying because we don't want to do what he wants us to listen. And with you, it's really interesting how you talked about, there isn't one thing that can happen in our life that our daddy doesn't either sanction or do himself. And you got laid off for a divine purpose, right? And the question was, were you listening?
Right.
Were you prescribing that to higher power doing that in your life? So tell us what happens next. You say it's a long story, but we got all day. So what happens next? You decide on the 7-year odyssey to start your graduate study, your doctoral work. Tell us more about what happens in that journey.
Well, I knew I wanted to attend Utah State University, which is the university where my dad went to school. And I knew they had a good program in what I wanted to study. So we were living in the Minneapolis area at the time. So the first step is we had to move. We had a Toyota Corolla and a top carrier, and we loaded everything we could fit into that. And our oldest daughter, Rachel, poor Rachel, had to sit in the back seat with her legs straight out in front of her because there were boxes underneath. And we moved, and anything we couldn't take, we brought to the laundry room in the apartment complex and said, well, it's free. You can have it. So we had to make this decision. Are we all in or not? And we were. So we went out to Utah. I worked for a year to make sure I had residency there. And I had been accepted to graduate school. And another blessing, though it didn't always seem it at the time, because I was struggling to find good employment as we were transitioning. I had more time during the day than I was used to. So I got some manuals to study my graduate examination test, the GRE test. And I studied all the time. And I ended up doing really well on that. And if I had been in my normal life situation, I don't think that would have happened. But because God gave me that opportunity to have extra time, and I used it, I didn't just sit. I used the time He gave me, studied as hard as I could, and not only got into school, but got a full 1-year scholarship to start the program. So 6 years, just tremendous opportunities and a lot of hard work. Sometimes people think when God's inspiring you to do something that He's done all the work and you're off the hook, but that is not the case. He's going to set you on a path that will change you. You're going to have to work hard and trust in Him enough to get up every morning and follow through with what He asks you to do. So I learned that really well in my 6 years in graduate school. And then we reached another junction with finishing that and then what to do. So again, I'd sure like to see where you want me to go.
Well, and I guess my next question is, were there times where extended family, you said your partner, your wife, right? I mean, I couldn't have done anything and haven't done anything in my life that's been good without Linda Smith. Okay. Everything she either said yes and amen, or she's been the one saying, what are you going to do? You're going to do, let's go. Right. And so I get how important having that life partner who's a cheerleader, an encourager, a butt kicker sometimes to get you to do the things and have not just the resilience, but the grit that it takes to achieve those long-term goals. But were there extended family members who kind of struggled with this journey of what are you doing, right? And how did you deal with that? Were people supportive? Or because oftentimes when we're embracing God's call, people are looking at us like we're crazy. right, in our lives. So how did that play out for you with extended family and friends? Did they support that with you? How are they a part of that journey?
Another profound question I appreciate being able to respond to there. We had some support, definitely, but as the experience went on and the years happened, I think sometimes there were doubts and sometimes even a little bit of, I hate to say, criticism. And I would say that there were some family members that thought I really didn't know what I was doing, and that how in the world could I have made this choice when I could have done better for my wife and children if I had just stayed where I was, found a different job, just stayed in that track. Why would I do this to them? And I could feel that subtly sometimes from them. And sometimes it wasn't so subtle. Sometimes it was fairly direct. I got a letter one time that was not fun to read. And I had to decide, okay, who do I listen to? These people that I love them, or do I remain committed to the inspiration I felt I received? And that can be very difficult at times. People that don't know you, people that don't love you and that aren't close to you, they really can't sway you much. It's the people that are close to you. They're now trying to call into question the decisions that you have made as you've tried to follow your call. They can have an impact, and sometimes I struggle with that. Like when I got this letter, it was very difficult to read from a family member. And I sat down and I wrote a response, and it was probably 3 pages long, just detailing everything that I thought they had perhaps seen in error. But then I tore that letter up. I just tore it up. I think I even
Uh,
burned it.
yeah.
And I wrote a new one. And it had only about 3 sentences. And it basically said, I know you're a very good person. And if you knew a little bit more about this situation, I think you might see it differently. Love, Aaron. And that's all
Yeah.
I sent.
How do you, Aaron, just to
Yeah.
jump in, how do you know the difference though? Right? So how does a person who is thinking about a call, how do they know the difference between, as you said, divine inspiration and this idea of their own personal wishes, right? Or the reality of this confusion psychologically that sometimes happens with us when we think this is what we're called to do, what higher power wants us to do, the creator wants us to do and has called us to do. But in the end, it isn't about, we'll talk about God supplies all your needs, right? One of my other daughter, okay, this is a whole nother thing, said to me one day, God gives us the desires of our heart, and sometimes our daughters forget that their dads have theology degrees. And so she's telling me about the desires of our heart. And I said, honey, your heart isn't what you want. Your heart is desperately what you need. You don't know your heart is doing anything until your heart ain't working. Okay. Your heart is about pumping oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. We need our heart for survival, not the heart in Valentine's Day. The heart is an organ that we can't live without. The only person that knows what our heart needs is God, right? And he gives us what that needs, not what our head needs, right? So, how did you discern and how would you give us advice to discern between what is our personal wishes and divine inspiration, as well as this concept of psychological confusion?
That's something that I continue to sort out, but I think I've gotten a little bit better at it over the years than I was 30, 40 years ago. A couple of filters I think apply. This idea that we can be divinely guided, as you are very aware, is a concept that has been used inappropriately throughout history. And people feeling they're divinely guided uh, has resulted in wars, has resulted in abuse, on and on. And it's really important that we get it right, because if we get it wrong, we can make some horrible mistakes, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. So, one of the filters I think that applies is we know the two great commandments to love the Lord our God with all our heart, might, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. I don't think that any divine guidance will ever counter those two great commandments. So that's one filter. If we ever feel anything that's going to cause us to hurt another person, that's coming from the wrong place. So that's a filter. Another lesson I think I have learned is divine guidance comes persistently and gently and calmly. We're not filled with anxiety. It's there's a scripture that's a favorite of mine. It's Moses actually in Deuteronomy chapter 32, and he's talking about how the Lord speaks to us. He compares it to the dews from heaven that come very gently and very calmly to us. Every day they come, and we need to be aware of that. It's not this dramatic, life shattering. I mean, it can be, but those are very rare. Normally, it's just like the dews from heaven, very calm, very gentle, very persistent. And if you're feeling that, you're probably on the right track. But if you're feeling anxious, fearful, you have to re-examine where this is coming from. It might be your own psyche. If we believe in God, we believe in the enemy, the adversary. It might be coming from him. So, a couple of lessons I've learned, I think that I hope have got me on the right track a little better. And the more we are in tune with the will of God and follow it, the more our will and his become aligned over time. So pretty soon it's hard to distinguish, well, not soon, but eventually it's hard to distinguish one from the other. But that does take a lot of work. And I think he understands that. If we're
Sure.
struggling with our own wishes and will, he understands that process, and he wants us to struggle with that actually. And he'll gently guide us into a little bit better and a little bit higher path as we go.
When it's okay to consult, and consult could be a conversation in the car. See, the part
Mm-hmm.
of it that some folks struggle with is, you got to genuflect and you got to get on your, and those things are great, but you can be in the car talking to your daddy. And
Mm-hmm.
because he knows you're omnipotent, right? He
Right.
knows. So it's okay for me to get in the car and say, Lord, I am struggling with this. And just have a conversation like you and I are having, because he
Mm-hmm.
knows I'm having that same conversation in my head. Tell me, show me, guide me. My pastor said to me once when I told him, I can't go into the ministry. I swear too much. I listen to Tupac. I chase girls. I play college football. How am I? And Pastor Howie Crinky said, God opens doors. You need to be in him enough to see when they're open and faithful enough to walk through, even though you don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
And that has guided my entire life. My whole life has been an unintended journey of walking through doors that after consulting, I'm like, okay, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with this, but let's go. Right. Because my limits were different. What I wanted to end us on is one of my favorite pieces, which I is the scriptural piece that I think people mess up, like many, several times, is Romans 8:28. And the first part is all things work for the good, right, of those who love him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the piece that people mess up in the original Greek, it isn't for good. All things don't work for good. Like you ain't gonna sit back and say, like when your father passed away, it was like, oh, this is great. No, it wasn't good, but it was for the good. It was for your own good. But the covenant part, the promise part, happens after that statement. All things work for the good of those who love me if we are called according to his purpose, right? That's that covenant. And that's the calling part of it. Talk a little bit about not just because to me it's the love of the creator more than myself and being willing to say thy will be done, whatever you want me to do. And then following the call and you know, it's Carol Dweck growth mindset before Carol Dweck ever set her she was even thought of. It's all about your perspective. So if you are doing the creator's call in your life and you love the creator and the world and you follow those two great commandments, then you will look back on even the most horrific storms and challenges in your life and you're like, that sucked, but I get it. It was for my own good.
Mhm.
Talk a little bit, Aaron, about that balance, balancing the realities and the complexities of that promise with your journey and some of those lessons that you would help the rest of us see in when we are following the call to be able to look back on all of those experiences and times and those storms and see, yeah, those things happened and they were bad at the time, but they happened for my own good.
Again, this is a question where my understanding continues to grow. I've gone through some experiences that were horrendous and unexpected. And I thought to myself, how can this possibly be good? Why is this even happening to me? I don't know how to process this. It's so far out of the realm of what I thought I would experience in life. I don't know how to handle this. And I would pray daily for some relief, some guidance, some inspiration of how to deal with something that would even make me physically sick, in the mornings, just being nauseous about how do I handle this? Isn't there a way out? And I learned through that experience is don't lose your trust in God. And if he brings you to it, he'll bring you through it. And then when it's over, and I'm not saying it was good, but when it's over, you come out of that a better person and more able, perhaps, to serve people who are also struggling in some way. And they need a listening ear. And maybe that can be you. And prior to me going through some of these things, that couldn't have been me. I couldn't have done it. I'm a very intellectual person. I read academic books, but you have to go through this sometimes to be able to connect on a human level. And I think that God wanted me to do that. I, I don't I don't relish that process sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
but I know that it's made me a better person than I would have been otherwise.
Well, and holding on to that promise, the first half, that if I get through this and if I love him and if I continue to walk in my call, that I will, because God don't break promises. He says all things will be for your own good. All, not some, not a few, not the ones we want to, all of them, everything. And so for me, and like you said, bro, we're both old dads now and granddads, and we are still doing our work, and we're going to keep doing our work until we've taken our last breath on this earth. And we're hopefully going to be better people, humans then, but we ain't going to be done. And these are the kind of things that you try to hold on to as long as I am following the purpose. He promises you will look back on this, even the worst horrific thing in your life, and say, hey, I get it. That was for my own good. And you will at least, whether it is for your personal good or like you're saying, right? You're able to use those experiences to bless and serve and love other people. Yes?
Yes, absolutely. I love your emphasis on the word all. My wife knows that's one of my favorite statements. One of the most important words in the scriptures is the word all.
Mm,
All means all. And
100.
if you can read the scriptures and know that all means all, that changes your perception of God entirely and his promises, his covenants with us. All means all. We're not worshiping some great lawyer in the sky where there are, provisions that he can work
That's
his way
right.
around here. When he says all, that means all. And I've learned to place faith in that.
Ah, Aaron Kelson, thank you so much for not only sharing your wisdom, but sharing your heart, sharing your stories, sharing your inspiration with us, brother. Thank you so much for the time today. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us.
It's been my pleasure. I've really enjoyed talking with you, Adam.
Thank you.
We appreciate you joining us for this episode of Get Uncomfortable. There are a variety of ways that you can support the show, including leaving a review, sharing an episode with a friend, or visiting us at getuncomfortablepodcast.com to visit our merch store or request sponsorship information. Until next time, stay uncomfortable.